Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Young Friends of MHS program, How Did That Get There, with Hattie. Thank you, Hattie, so much for doing this for us this evening. I'm here in place of Young Friends committee member who would usually be moderating this, but I had to step in last minute, so I've got my Young Friends hat on today. But my name is Rebecca McBride, for those of you who don't know me, and I work for the Missouri Historical Society as our membership and annual fund manager. The Young Friends is a group that introduces young adults and professionals to the Missouri Historical Society and kind of works as ambassadors to encourage people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s to get involved with the Missouri Historical Society. So if you are interested in serving on that committee, you can reach out to me. My email address is rmcbride@mohistory.org, or you can email youngfriends@mohistory.org, and we can send you more information. If you want to just stay in the know about the Young Friends, you are welcome to sign up for our e-newsletter or just register for upcoming events. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Hattie.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So I was really excited when Rebecca asked me to do this presentation because the strange and unusual and extraordinary things from our collection are some of my favorites to share with people because they don't often get seen. The stuff that I'll be featuring tonight is kind of a peek at some of the objects I've discovered in my time here at MHS that really don't often get featured on the blog or in our presentations otherwise or in exhibits. So I hope you'll enjoy this, and I will leave plenty of time for questions at the end if we have any. So I like to start off with a really quick introduction to what's in our collection. The Missouri Historical Society collection is huge. We have about 175,000 individual objects. That is not to mention prints and photographs and everything else like archival material and sound and moving images. This is just our objects. So it's a really big collection. And we've been collecting for about 150 years now. And we collect everything from Native American objects to contemporary art and everything in between. So you will find just a little bit of everything in our collections, from furniture to a pink kitchen to ribbons from the German Committee for the World's Fair to firefighter boots worn by Anita Stewart, one of the first Black female firefighters for the city of St. Louis. And one of the things I always like to point out is that our contemporary collecting efforts are really unique, and we try to be very active in the way that we collect so that we can fill holes that were left in our collection by collecting practices in the past that did not seek out the objects that tell the stories of people who are marginalized. So one of the things we try to do with our collecting initiatives that you might hear about, we have our African American collecting initiative, our LGBTQ collecting initiative, is to fill those holes of underrepresented communities in our collections so that they really do represent all of St. Louis and all of Missouri. Whoops, there we go. However, I will say that as extraordinary as some of the things in our collection are, you would be amazed at the really curious things that I discovered. So I started this position just over 2.5 years ago. And one of the first things that I did was spend a lot of time in our storerooms, exploring shelf by shelf what we had. And I started keeping notes about some of the really strange things that I came across. And that is the basis of this presentation, is those really curious objects. The first one I picked is a crazy quilt. Very good name for this presentation, starting right off the bat. It's crazy. Crazy quilts were a Victorian quilt fad that the maker would compile the top of the quilt pieced from as many different pieces of fabric and styles of sewing and technique as they could to create this huge, just visually intense quilt. And we have quite a few of these crazy quilts in our collection, but the craziest of all the crazy quilts is the one we like to call the chipmunk quilt. Now, the chipmunk quilt's maker wanted to make a truly impressive crazy quilt. She was going to make a crazy quilt for a benefit auction for the Melanphy Public Hospital, and she hoped that it would raise a lot of money for the hospital. So she put a lot of work into this quilt, as you can see from the elaborate stitching that's all across the top. But it wasn't enough for her just to have pieces of beautiful, expensive fabrics put into the top of her quilt, like silk and velvet. She worked in 2 taxidermied chipmunks and 2 taxidermied birds into the top of her quilt. And you can see the 2 chipmunks here. They're stuffed, they've got these glass eyes, and the chipmunk has actually been cut in half so that you have 2 chipmunks who are facing each other. And this is just an extraordinary item. It did raise a lot of money for the Melanphy Hospital. It raised about $500, which is an incredible sum of money in 1882. But one of the funny things is, it's a crazy quilt. It's got some chipmunks and birds on it. And the person who won the quilt at the auction did not really want it. So they actually gave it back to the woman who had made it, who then in turn gifted it to her brother and sister-in-law at their wedding. And the brother and sister-in-law did not use the quilt either, because it's a little off-putting to have taxidermy chipmunks on your bed. So they in turn eventually donated it to us. And it's an incredible piece, but it's definitely the strangest quilt we have in our collection. Another really odd object is this hand that was carved from soap about 1930. And this hand is part of thousands of objects that we have at MHS that were gifted in the years following Charles Lindbergh's historic flight from New York to Paris. They were gifted to him by people from across the world. And these pieces range from incredibly rare, incredibly valuable, silver and ceramic objects and pieces of art. You might have seen Flores Mexicanas, which was on exhibit at MHS last year, I believe. But it was also things just produced by everyday people who were amazed by his flight and wanted to give him something. And this hand is one of those things. It was carved by Marlon Viciard in Edwardsville, Illinois, and sent in the mail to Lindbergh. He, in turn, immediately donated it to us. I don't know that he really wanted to keep a soap hand that's just a little bit creepy around his house. So we've had it ever since. My screen is not changing well. So speaking of things that were carved, this is an incredible piece made by an itinerant artist who was working in the very early 20th century across much of the United States. This is one of those pieces. It's not really a creepy piece or an incredibly strange piece. To me, it's an amazing piece because Carl Werner was incredibly fast with his assemblages in bottles. Now, most people, when you think of making a ship in a bottle or something like that as a hobby, It's something that is done over, you know, a long period of time with an incredible level of attention to detail and finesse. Not Carl. He was able to create these beautiful scenes in bottles in only a few hours. And he worked so quickly making these pieces from cut up cigar boxes and like wax crayons and things like that. He worked so quickly because that's how he paid for his room and board as he worked his way across the United States. So this is the only example of Carl Werner's work that we have in our collection. And it's a really unique one in his overall body of work for several reasons. One of which you can see in the detail photo that it says Klossman's beer on it. And that was a brewer down in Carondelet area. And it was kind of rare for Carl Werner's pieces to mention specific places within the piece. But he must have really enjoyed his meal or stay at Klossman's. And the second thing is the inclusion of the African American figure that is standing on the far right or left side of the bottle. And that is actually one of the only known pieces of Werner's work that includes an African American figure. So one of my favorite kind of collections within the collection is our hair art collection. Not a lot of people think about hair art. Maybe you do, I don't know. I had never thought about hair art too much before seeing the impressive number of pieces that we have at MHS. And that led me down a real rabbit hole of researching the meaning and the importance of these hair art assemblages in Victorian society. So when Queen Victoria lost her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, it kicked off a phase of her life that was deeply in mourning, and it really lasted for her most of the rest of her life. And one of the sort of byproducts of having a queen in mourning was that it really took the Victorian people's obsession with death and obsession with mourning to new heights. It created just this cult of mourning, really, where there was increased ritual and practice around death and the memory of loved ones. And hair assemblages had been popular for a long time. You can find everything from jewelry boxes to snuff boxes and lockets with bits and pieces of loved ones' hair from, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. But in the Victorian era, hair as art reached whole new heights with these wreaths that people would form from the locks of loved ones. And this piece is very poignant to me because so often, as was generally the practice, this hair came from deceased loved ones. And in the 19th century, as in times before, death rates were at an all-time high, especially for children. They were incredibly vulnerable to things like cholera. And this piece was made by a Mrs. A. Chapman, and she was actually 12 when she made the piece. And I believe that is her standing in this photograph with her younger siblings. And this piece is so meaningful because she created it with the hair of her siblings, but not all of her siblings were alive at the point that she made this. And that is embodied by the fact that the wreath is actually open at the top, which was a symbol of, pointing towards heaven and the connection of this, hair and this photograph to heaven in connection with the lost loved one. Kind of continuing on that theme of the Victorians and their obsession with remembering and memorializing death, this is a coffin handle. And this was one of those pieces from our collection that truly has me perplexed. I have done so much research into this piece and cannot get the answers that I want to explain how it ended up from a grave in Virginia all the way to St. Louis in the 20th century. So this is a coffin handle from the coffin of General Daniel Morgan. And Morgan was a Revolutionary era general. He was a patriot and really an influential person whose name you don't hear a lot with the other, people from that era. But in fact, he was actually partial inspiration for the movie The Patriot. And Morgan died in 1802, and his remains were laid to rest in Virginia. And they laid there, like most people's remains do, for quite a while. But Morgan's remains were actually dug up right after the Civil War, and they were reinterred at a very nice new Victorian-style cemetery, not too far from the original church cemetery he had been buried at. And this new cemetery was, done in the height of the Victorian style, almost like a park, like we know cemeteries today, with trees and flowers and groomed landscape. And when they reinterred him, they actually pulled the handles off the coffin and they inscribed them. And I can only guess that they were given away perhaps to descendants or friends or people who may have had a connection with him as mementos of his life and death. But that's well and good, but how did it get to St. Louis? And that is the real mystery. So this piece was donated to us in the 1920s, which was, 50 years or so after it was dug up and the handle was inscribed with the inscription you see on the screen. And I've tried everything to make the connection. I've traced Morgan's descendants to see if any of them live in Missouri. Can't find them. I've traced the donor's ancestry to see if he had a connection to Morgan. Can't find one. But I have some hypotheses that could pan out eventually. So Daniel Morgan's first cousin was named Daniel Boone. And the Boone family moved to Missouri quite early on. And I have wondered if there is a connection there somehow. But also, Morgan was a Mason. And Masons frequently retained objects that had importance to former members or symbolic meaning for members. And I've wondered if this piece perhaps came in connection with a local Masonic lodge. I have not been able to find any conclusive evidence, but I did recently discover a photograph of another handle with a similar inscription that is part of a small museum in Virginia. So I'm working to see how they got theirs, and maybe that'll give me a light bulb moment to solve this mystery. Another piece that I have always found very intriguing is this toothpick. This is not how we would picture a toothpick. We have those little wooden ones or little plastic ones that you use to stab hors d'oeuvres at functions with. But in times gone past, the toothpick was this really indispensable article of oral hygiene. And this goes all the way back to, really, really early times, pre-Roman times even. Humans were using toothpicks to clean their teeth. But the toothpick really took on new heights of style in the 1700s, 1800s, that time period. it was so fashionable to have highly ornate or carved toothpicks. You could find them in silver, you could find them in gold, you could find them in bone or ivory, and sometimes they even had jewels or other precious stones embedded in the handles. And that was considered like a really, really effective way to clean your teeth. But what I find funny is that when wooden toothpicks were introduced in the late 19th century, and you can see a newspaper article clipping about that. It's the upper of the two clippings on this slide. When the wooden toothpicks were introduced, people were really quite horrified. They thought it was uncouth, unhygienic. They thought it was just impolite to have a wooden toothpick. Why would you even want that? Why would you go around chewing on your wooden toothpick? And you can see that this newspaper from Marshville, Missouri, even claimed that it could lead to fatal results if you were using a wooden toothpick. Fast forward, not that long, a little over a decade, to 1902, and you can see this newspaper article in the lower part of the screen that proclaims that St. Louis has become the toothpick capital. And that is because there were several toothpick factories here in St. Louis manufacturing them that were sent out all over the country. But this piece has always made me laugh because it's clearly meant to be such a risque piece. It's not something that would read as particularly risque in modern times, but 100 and something years ago, this woman's leg with the sight of the fishnet stocking at the top, that would have been a very risque piece for a man to have as a toothpick. So anybody who knows me knows that I love ceramics, I love pottery, and I am obsessed with our snake jugs that we have here at MHS. And we have two of these amazing handmade jugs that have snakes dramatically coiled around the body of the jug and around the opening. And you can see that this one has two snakes on it. There's one up at the top that forms a handle, and then there's one wrapped around the body with spotted scales on it. And I am obsessed with these pieces because aesthetically, they're really awesome. I mean, who doesn't love this? But there's a deeper meaning behind these jugs that lets us have a peek at what life was like and the issues that people found really important in the 19th century. So when I say prohibition, most people think, oh, 20th century prohibition. And you think of gangsters and all of that. But prohibition had roots in the 19th century in the temperance movement and in efforts by people to abolish the manufacture and sale of alcohol. And that started really in the mid 19th century, but picked up steam later. And what's really interesting is that the symbolism of prohibition, that early prohibition, was often a snake. And that's because a snake goes, as a symbol all the way back to, hearken of biblical times when, the snake was said to tempt Eve. It's seen as this evil symbol. And you can really even see that still today. I mean, clearly it's, not a particularly thought of as still a scary animal, or, it's thought of something as associated with a little darker side, like in Harry Potter. But for the temperance movement, this was an important symbol to remind people that alcohol was evil. And there's a pottery company that was active in the last half of the 19th century across the river over in Anna, Illinois. And it was operated by the Kirkpatrick brothers. And they were well known for their snake jugs that espoused views of temperance. And theirs were incredibly elaborate snake jugs that sometimes had, as many as a dozen or more snakes that were coiled around it, and sometimes with poems or verse about, the evils of liquor and consumption of liquor. And what I find very interesting is that not long after the Kirkpatrick brothers started making their snake jugs, in support of the temperance movement, here in Missouri, you can find that there were potters in outstate that started making these snake jugs, and they might have been, I suppose, making them in support of temperance. But what I really think is that they were making them as a tongue-in-cheek satirical response to people who were so impassioned by temperance. And in outstate Missouri at this time, it was very common to have home brewing of alcohol. It was easy to get your hands on a still. This was not something that happened in the 1920s alone. This was happening much earlier. And so I think that some of these Missouri potters might have been making their own snake jugs as a tongue-in-cheek way to say, oh, well, who cares if our whiskey jug has a snake on it? It's not going to bother us. And if you're interested in seeing one of these pieces for yourself, one of our 2 snake jugs is actually on exhibit in the exhibit Seeking St. Louis Currents, and it's in the back of that exhibit, and you can spot it on a shelf with some other ceramics and glassware. This is part of our sculpture collection that we have at MHS. And it really sticks out among all of our examples of sculpture that we have because it's of a plumber. And this piece caught my eye pretty early on because I was really curious about what this person was supposed to be carrying. But when I got to looking closer, it is absolutely plumber's tools. And that was kind of strange to me. I could not figure that out because the maker of this piece, Frederick Gene Thallinger, was a really well-known, well-respected sculpture artist in the mid-20th century. He has works that are part of the Smithsonian's collection. He was a well-respected artist who did very serious work that often tackled, themes of, war, human injustice and suffering. They're very serious themes that Thallinger most often tackled in his sculpture work. A mother who has lost her son in World War II is the theme of one of his pieces. And so to see then this plumber who's kind of hunched over after maybe a hard day's work was so left field for me. And I've still not been able to determine the story behind it. But I really love the piece. And over time, I've sort of developed this backstory to it in my head where maybe Thallinger and his family were, about to have a Thanksgiving party that was going to be ruined by a clogged sink or something. And plumber to the rescue saved the day, and maybe this piece was made in honor of that plumber. I don't know. It's a way to explore why Thallinger might have made this sculpture of a plumber, and we may never know the true story, but I think it's a really fun piece that gives you a flip side look at his work that goes way beyond just these serious and heavy themes of war and sadness and things like that, to look at just a fun sculpture of a plumber. So this is a human skull that was used for teaching purposes by Dr. Joseph McDowell at the McDowell Teaching College, that was like a medical college here in St. Louis prior to the Civil War. And my fascination with this man is really because he was a crazy person. The more I have read about Dr. McDowell, the more I think I would have been probably scared to know him, actually. He kept a pet bear in his basement, and that is only the start of things. He decided that he needed to, at one point, arm his students there at the college, and he bought cannons and rifles for his students, and this was prior to the Civil War. He also was known to take his students on nighttime grave raids to get the bodies that they wanted to do experiments and autopsies and things on for their classes. And he was adamant that upon his death, his body would be suspended in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. So this was a very, very eccentric man. And this human skull was actually used at the college and then eventually presented to one of his students so many years later. And so I don't know the story of why it was given to one of his students, but I can't imagine that that is a great graduation present. I would not recommend that as a graduation present for anyone in your life. This is a really fun piece. And it sort of starts off with a backstory that's a little bit sad. So this coat was actually hand knit from Afghan hound dog fur. And it was made by a woman named Lizette. And Lizette had actually gone through a tough divorce in the late 1940s. She had 2 kids and was just having a really hard time with finding herself alone with her kids, and at the end of her marriage in a time that was still not very accepting and friendly to women who had gone through a divorce. And to sort of cope with all of this, she decided that she would get 2 dogs, and she got Pie and Stripe. And you can see a photo of Lizette there in the middle photo with her 2 dogs, these Afghan hounds that were gorgeous. And Lizette was absolutely meticulous about her dog's coats. And Afghan hounds have the most amazing fur coats. They're just glossy and silky and just wonderful. And Lizette would brush them every single day. And she started realizing that she was just getting so much fur off of these dogs. And she would sort of collect it in a container before tossing it out when the container got full. But she always felt like it was a waste of that gorgeous fur to just throw it away. One day, she saw an advertisement in a magazine for a woman in California who was a fiber artist and who did spinning and carding of wool and other fibers and could even do dog fur. And so Lizette had one of those light bulb moments, and she started collecting Pie and Stripe's fur and sent it off to California to be spun into skeins of wool and sent back to her to use for her project of making a house coat from Pie and Stripe's fuzzy fur. And this is the final creation. You can see with the nice pockets. It does look like a nice cardigan coat type thing to wear around the house. But apparently, there's a reason that we don't buy things at the store made from dog fur. It's very scratchy. And so Lizette never really wore the coat because it was quite scratchy. And she never made anything with the leftover yarn. And so eventually, after she passed, this fabulous piece was donated to us along with some photographs of her, pie, and stripe, and the leftover skeins of yarn that she didn't end up using. And I can say we have some really nice wool things in the collection, some cashmere things. This is the only thing made from dog fur that we have. This could also, I have always wanted someone to pick this up as a COVID hobby. Nobody I know has done this yet, but I still think that someone should figure out how to spin some wool as just this crazy COVID hobby. So let me know if you decide to do that. This is a piece of art from our art collection. And this is something that really sort of jumped out off the art racks to me when I was working my way through our collection, exploring it, pulling out the art screens. And, you know, I was just constantly dazzled by the gorgeous portraits and landscapes that we have. You know, big names like Thomas Hart Benton and George Caleb Bingham and, you know, Joe Jones and Amy Schweig. Really, really great stuff in our fine art collection. And then I pulled open a screen and saw this huge sign. I don't have the dimensions of this hand-painted sign, but you know, it is at least like 4 feet long. It's a big piece. And I was like so curious to know what the story was behind it. And I started doing some research and discovered this incredible character that was Jesse Howard. And Jesse Howard was a character from Fulton, Missouri. And he had a lot to say and a lot to share with the world, but he didn't have Twitter to get his message out there. So he started making signs and hanging them on the fence outside his farm in Fulton. And they started off somewhat normal. He was writing messages to the kids that he felt like were trespassing or being loud, and he would write messages to them. And, you know, other things like that. And to his neighbors. He wasn't a particularly friendly person, I don't. But as time went on, Jesse Howard got incredibly sort of paranoid about the world. He was paranoid about government, about communism, about the local sheriff who he did not feel was doing his job. He was terrified of people trespassing or spying on him. And so his signs got increasingly long and wordy as he would go on rants about what was bothering him. And this one is where he's talking about some of those trespassers. And he says, you know, who is bugging Sorehead Hill? And Sorehead Hill is what he named his farm there in Fulton, which is just such a lovely name, isn't it? Sorehead Hill. And he is saying that someone's bugging it. And where is Mr. Howard Hughes, who I believe was the name of the sheriff, that he felt like was not doing a good job of protecting his property? So, as you might imagine, someone this eccentric caught people's attention. And this was, you know, in the post-war period when folk and outsider art was really having a heyday. And Mr. Howard got the attention of some larger art magazines and folk art collectors who started to take an interest in his work. And I think it was in 1960 that there was a big write-up in a national art magazine about him, and that kicked off this kind of frenzy to collect his work. And so you can find Jesse Howard's pieces, these messages scrawled on board or trash can lids or anything he could find. You can find it in collections across the country, everything from MHS to the High Museum in Atlanta, to the, I think the Denver Art Museum has a piece. They're all over, but it is such an eccentric piece. And if you're interested in his work, I would recommend that you go listen to the NPR piece that was done on him a few years ago. It's pretty great. So I think this is my last piece, and I put it last because this piece does not really have a story that I know of. It doesn't have an amazing maker or anything like that. To me, this piece is just plain creepy. If things come alive in the museum at night, which I get asked a lot, no, I don't know if they do. I don't think they do. But if they did, this is the piece I would be most terrified to see come to life. And this was a music box made in Germany in about 1890. And when the music box is played and wound up and it plays its little piece, the dolls and dogs actually move and dance with the music. Now, I have never wound this up, but you can see how they're attached by wires and how the backs of the chairs are hinged. So when it plays, the dogs will move as if they're playing their instruments or dancing on the table, and the dolls, who appear to be quite haunted, will move back and forth in their chair. This would have been given to a child. This would have been a child's toy, and not a particularly cheap piece either. But I cannot imagine opening this on Christmas morning to see these terrifying dolls and dogs with real hair staring back at you. So that is my my presentation about some of the crazy, odd, random, and creepy things that I have found in our collection. And I would love to leave some time for questions. I will also add that I would love to get input from anybody who enjoyed this or who wanted to see more of a certain type of object. I plan to do an exhibit of some of these curiosities from our collection in the future, and am working out kind of the direction to take it. So do we want to take it more creepy or just more extraordinary objects or more of the mysteries from the collection? So if you have a thought on that, let me know.
Yeah, so if you do have any questions, please use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we can get those asked to Hattie. So, yeah. So Hattie, I'll ask one. Are there any paintings that we have in the collection that are particularly odd or interesting or surprising to you? I know that that's another part of the collection that you're responsible for.
Yeah, so we have, we have a lot of paintings that definitely come under the category of mysteries, where, we don't know, who the sitter is, or, we don't know the symbolism of some of the things that have been included. Yeah. But there are a few things that come to mind, thinking of things kind of in this category of like weird or creepy. One of them is actually on exhibit in Seeking St. Louis Currents, and there is a portrait of two young children with their cat in the background, or at least I think it's a cat. but you can go and see this painting for yourself. And I think it's been posted on our social media accounts, so check there. But I swear this cat looks absolutely demonic, and it is terrifying. And people in the 19th century, for some reason, had a very hard time painting animal faces. And dogs, cats, they all end up looking kind of human-like in the face. And
Okay.
this cat's particularly creepy.
I'll have to check that out next week when I'm in the museum again. So we did get one question come through. With some of these items, and the asker was specifically thinking about the quilt taxidermy or the dog coat. How do you go about conservation?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So I know that with things like fur, oftentimes it is an incredibly detailed process that the conservator goes through to clean it. And it's complicated further by the fact that a lot of early taxidermy was done with very harmful chemicals that can actually hurt you even 150 years later. So
Wow.
first the conservator has to determine, is there something like arsenic, or is there something else in this taxidermy that could harm me, or this fur? And then if they determine it's not, oftentimes it's this painstaking process of using tweezers to remove bits of lint and dust,
Wow.
or light air that they can spray across it to dislodge some of that. So it's this like very detailed conservation process just to clean a piece. But as far
Yeah.
as going about something that might have damage or something like that, oof,
Yeah.
I can't even begin to tell you the details of what a conservator would have to do. But that's a
Yeah.
really good question.
I remember when we had the Little Black Dress exhibit, there were a couple of artifacts that were in that exhibit that were the hair art, like you were talking about,
Yes.
that had to be conserved. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think that there was even a blog post done about the conservation on that.
Okay.
I obviously have no idea, but I kind of wonder if the same kind of thing would go into conservation for like a taxidermy, in terms of just like how do you deal with very minute details without like damaging the hair.
Yeah. I know that, our conservator generally at the outset of a project like that will give an estimate of how many hours they think it will take
Yeah.
to get something done. And it is often hundreds of hours. So weeks and weeks of work go into
Yeah.
some of these projects.
Wow.
Someone says that they
Yeah.
have a friend who spins dog hair with wool to knit hats for the owners of the dogs. You have to mix the dog hair with very soft wool to be able to tolerate wearing it. That's what Lizette did not know. She did not know to mix it with wool to be able to tolerate it. Great. I love that someone is doing that. I mean, it's so funny.
Absolutely. Let's see. So we've got another question. What type of birds were on the crazy quilt, and were they also cut in half?
That is a good question. I don't know what type of birds were included on that quilt, but yes, they were also cut in half to kind of give that mirrored effect, which is
Yeah.
really
Is that crazy quilt on the digital collection search?
It is. You can find it and see the overall photos, and should be able to download a high enough resolution image to zoom in and see the birds and the chipmunks.
Yeah, so there might also, within the description for that piece, there might be more information about what kind of bird is there also, that sometimes is included.
Yeah, and I will also say that like curators are not experts in everything. And oftentimes we rely on people who sort of volunteer their information and their knowledge to be like, oh, I know what kind of bird that is. So if you do go and look and you do happen to know what kind of bird it is, let me know, because that could be really helpful. Let's see. crazy quilt trend, was it common to include taxidermy, or was this just an outlier? So I have never seen another quilt that includes taxidermy, and I have done a lot of looking online and in some of our quilt compendium volumes, and have never found one.
Yeah, it certainly was one of the first artifacts that was pointed out to me when I started working at the museum as like and here's something you're not going to see anywhere else.
Yes, it is so unexpected to pull that out and to, see those tiny chipmunks stuck to the quilt. It is so strange. I can see why people did not really want it. It's a great thing to see in a museum.
Yeah.
But it's a creepy thing to think about having in your home.
Yeah, it's also not super practical because crazy quilts were sometimes used as like wall hangings, right? But not all the time. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, so crazy quilts were often more like show pieces, and a lot of people would have them over like a quilt hanger or on the wall, or on the back of a settee, or oftentimes like on the foot of their bed, or something like that. And they were definitely those kind of show-stopping quilts that were meant to be seen but not really used.
Okay. Well, neat. Well, are there any other questions that want to be submitted before we wrap up for the evening? Give it just a couple more moments here.
And I think I saw somebody who said in the chat that they were definitely interested in creepy things for, possible inclusion in an exhibit. So that's really good to know.
Yeah.
I think people love the creepy stuff.
Here's another question. With 175,000 items, how do you get to know the items?
Oh, that's a really good point. So I will say that thankfully we have a team of 5 curators to help us out with these, these issues of like having such a vast collection and being responsible for it. So we have this team of curators who takes different parts of the collection as their own. And that's really helpful because then you're not responsible for using and really being able to know all of them. But for me, it's an ongoing process that started out when I first got here and really just spent several weeks walking through the aisles of our storerooms and getting to know the collection. And then it's gone on from there where I try to use everything as an opportunity to go deeper into our collection and not just my own. So, in coming up with presentations like this and writing blog posts or articles for our member magazine, for me, every time I do something like that is an opportunity to not just fall back on the things I know and the stories I know, but to go deeper and try and uncover new ones.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I guess we should get wrapped up for the evening. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. As we said before, if you are interested in getting involved in the Young Friends Steering Committee, please email youngfriends@mohistory.org, or you can get in touch with me. My name is Rebecca. And we do want to let you know that we have one more Young Friends event this year that will be on October 28th at the same time. And this time, the History on Tap is going to be about true crime in St. Louis. So it should be a interesting little pre-Halloween storytelling time with Amanda Clark, who is our works in public programs and runs our CSTL programs. So we hope that you'll be able to join us there.
Extraordinary storyteller. So that is going to be an amazing event.
Yeah, it's going to be really, really interesting. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that one. Thank you again so much, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.